3 days after I buried my father, I walked into my own kitchen and found my husband sitting there in his sweatpants, sipping coffee, completely unbothered, as if the man who raised me had not just been lowered into the ground. What he said next did not sound like grief. It sounded like a business decision, and by the time he finished talking, I understood that my marriage had a price tag attached to it, and my husband had already decided what that price tag was worth. My name is Nora Bennett. I am 52 years old, and for 22 years, I believed my marriage to Derek Bennett was steady, ordinary, and safe. We met in our late 20s, married quietly, raised our daughter Sophie together, and built the kind of life that looked, from the outside, completely fine. Derek worked in industrial sales for over 3 decades, chasing quotas, flying to regional meetings, answering calls on Sunday afternoons, because apparently commercial air filters were always some kind of emergency. I worked at a physical therapy clinic, kept our household running, and told myself that a long marriage is built on compromise. What I did not understand yet was how much of that compromise had only ever gone one direction. My father, Walter Ashford, sold his company, Ashford Mechanical, 6 years before he died. He was the kind of man who considered decorative pillows a personal offense and who once accused a tape measure of lying to him. He did not talk about money. He talked about baseball scores and property taxes and whether I was checking the oil in my car. When he passed away late on a Sunday night, I spent the next few days arguing with a florist over whether an arrangement called Heavenly Garden suited a man who barely tolerated flowers at all. That was the kind of grief I was carrying. Small, practical, exhausting grief. I was not thinking about inheritance. I was thinking about caskets and suits and which tie he would have hated the least. So when I walked into the kitchen that Wednesday morning and found Derek home, not at work, sitting there with his laptop closed the moment I appeared, my first thought was that maybe he had taken bereavement leave out of kindness. Instead, he told me he had quit his job. Not that day. The day before, the very morning after my father died. When I asked him why, he leaned back in his chair and said the words that changed everything between us. He said there was no point in working anymore, because my inheritance was enough for both of us. My father had been gone for 72 hours. His voicemail was still on my phone because I could not bring myself to delete it, and my husband had already retired on money that was not his. I asked him how he could possibly know what I would inherit, since we had never once discussed it. He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me more than his words did. He said, even conservatively, it had to be a few million. Conservatively, as if he had already run the numbers somewhere in his head, weeks or months before my father was even gone. I remember standing there thinking that I had never done that math myself. Yet somehow my husband already had a figure in mind and a plan attached to it, one he had never once mentioned to me until it became convenient to share. That evening, Derek's mother, Carol, came over with a lasagna, and his sister Renee brought wine. For 20 minutes, it felt almost normal. The 4 of us sitting around the table, while grief hovered politely in the background. Then Carol mentioned her rent had gone up again, and Derek said, without missing a beat, not to worry, because once everything cleared, he would buy her a house. Carol acted surprised, but only for a second, before mentioning she had already been looking at ranch homes near a neighborhood she liked. It became clear this was not the first time that conversation had happened between them. Then Derek turned to his sister and told her he would give her $200,000 to clear her debt completely. She stood up and hugged him before I could say a single word. I sat there holding a water glass, and nobody at that table had asked me a single question. Not how I was feeling, not what my father might have wanted, not what I might want to do with an inheritance that had not even been calculated yet. They had moved straight to distribution, as if I were simply the account number attached to my own name. When I finally spoke up and reminded everyone that my father had not even been buried yet, the table went silent, and Derek looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. Later that night, in the kitchen, he accused me of embarrassing his mother. I told him he had no right to promise either of them anything without asking me first. He answered that we were married, as though that single fact erased the need for a conversation entirely. The next morning, I received a call from my father's attorney, a careful, steady man named Nathan Cole. He asked me to come to his office alone, specifically because my father had requested it that way. When I mentioned that Derek could come along, there was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable, before Nathan repeated that my father wanted our first meeting to be just the two of us. I remember looking through the doorway at Derek, sitting on the couch scrolling through a listing for a used boat, and for the first time, I wondered exactly what my father had known that I did not. Nathan's office sat on the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind of place with narrow hallways and a directory that looked older than the elevator. He greeted me gently, guided me to a chair, and set a box of tissues off to the side that I promised myself I would not need. We talked through ordinary estate matters first: the house, the death certificate, small logistics that gave me something to hold on to. Then he closed the folder in front of him and asked if Derek had ever mentioned visiting my father alone. I told him no. Nathan said it had happened more than once. An in-person conversation, a phone call, and eventually an email, all discussing my future inheritance, without me present for any of it. He slid a letter across the table, written in my father's blocky, deliberate handwriting, the kind of writing that looked like it belonged in a court transcript. My father had recorded almost the entire exchange with Derek, nearly word for word. Derek had said that once I inherited everything, he could finally stop working. My father had answered that it would be my inheritance, not his. Derek had laughed it off and told my father not to be dramatic since we were married, so it made no real difference. Reading those lines felt like hearing an echo of the exact conversation Derek and I had in our own kitchen only days earlier, except this one had happened 11 months before my father died, long before either of us knew death was close. Nathan explained the numbers plainly. After charitable gifts and estate costs, the assets intended for me were valued around $3.8 million, not including the house. Most of it sat inside a trust my father had created before he passed, one that made me the sole beneficiary, but with a specific condition attached. For the first 5 years, any extraordinary distribution of principal required approval from an independent corporate trustee, a large gift to a relative, a speculative investment, money handed to someone else's failing business. All of it would require outside review before release. I asked Nathan directly why my father had placed a financial fence around me instead of simply talking to me himself. Nathan turned to the second page of the letter and let me read it myself. My father had written that he did not know for certain whether Derek would ever actually pressure me, and that 22 years of marriage meant far more than one overheard conversation. Then came the line that sounded exactly like him, the kind of sentence I could practically hear him clearing his throat before saying out loud. He wrote that he did not want to leave me his opinion of my husband along with his money. He was not trying to make a decision about my marriage. He was making sure nobody could rush me into one before I was ready to see clearly. That was the moment I finally reached for one of those tissues I had refused earlier, and Nathan had the decency to look away. When I got home, Derek asked immediately what the attorney had said, and specifically how much money was involved. I told him I was not discussing numbers on the same day I buried my father. He asked how long the approval process would take, and when I explained the trustee requirement, he paced the kitchen once and asked whether we could simply borrow against it instead. I asked if he had even checked. He had not. Then he said something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. He said he had already quit his job, as though his decision was an invoice, and I was somehow the one now responsible for paying it. That night, unable to sleep, I came downstairs for water and heard Derek on the phone in the den, his voice low and careful. He told someone not to panic, that the money existed. It was simply tied up for now, and that he would figure it out. Then he said the sentence I will never forget. He said I would come around eventually. I stood halfway down the staircase in the dark, and for the first time in our marriage, instead of walking in to confront him, I stayed silent and listened, because I finally wanted to hear what he said when he believed I was not listening at all. Over the following days, the full scale of Derek's plans revealed themselves piece by piece. A real estate agent emailed, thanking us for interest in a lake property, backed by a $5,000 deposit pulled straight from our joint account. Carol mentioned she had already told her landlord she likely would not renew her lease. Renee called asking when the estate would clear, because Derek had told her not to commit to a long repayment plan on her debt. My husband had not simply made promises. Other people had begun rearranging their entire lives around them, and none of them had asked me a single thing before doing so. When I confronted Derek about the timeline, pressing him on exactly when he resigned, he finally admitted the truth. He had submitted his resignation the morning after my father died, and the conversation with his boss about leaving had actually started weeks earlier, while my father was still alive. When I pointed that out, he grew defensive, accusing me of making things sound ugly, insisting we all knew what was coming since my father was 79 and sick. I asked him plainly when my father's estate had become his retirement account, and he grabbed his keys and walked out. Unable to answer, I called Nathan again and asked if that conversation with my father had truly been the only one. He told me it was not and invited me back downtown. This time there were no tissues in sight, or maybe I simply did not notice them anymore. He handed me several printed pages titled, "The Bennett Family Investment Plan," complete with projected returns, a proposed lake house, housing assistance for Carol, a line labeled Renee Business Debt Resolution, listing $200,000 to $250,000, and detailed retirement projections for Derek himself. My name appeared throughout the document, 14 times in total, always attached to numbers. Nowhere in those 6 pages was there a single line asking what I actually wanted for my own life. The document was dated 11 months before my father died, not 3 days, not a grief-stricken decision made in the fog of loss. 11 months, while my father was still going to the hardware store and calling me every Sunday to ask about my car. I told Nathan clearly that I did not want any inheritance transferred into our joint accounts. Not for now, not for anyone. When I told Derek that evening, his face changed in a way I had never seen before. For the first time since my father died, he did not look irritated or offended. He looked genuinely afraid, and I realized in that moment he had never once believed I might actually say no to him. Derek moved into our guest room, without either of us saying much about it out loud. Our house grew strangely polite, filled with careful, courteous small talk, instead of real conversation. Over the following weeks, though, something shifted. He cancelled the lake property and recovered the deposit. He rewrote his resume and started calling old contacts. One Saturday, folding laundry, I overheard him on the phone with Renee, telling her he should never have promised her that money, admitting plainly that it was never his to give in the first place. A few days later, I heard him call his mother and tell her not to give notice on her apartment, taking full responsibility for the promise he never should have made. That Sunday, I asked him to sit down with me at the kitchen table, the same table where he had promised his mother a house and his sister a fortune, while our father's funeral flowers still sat wilting in the living room. I placed Nathan's folder between us and walked him through every page, showing him exactly where his retirement appeared, where the lake house appeared, where his mother and sister appeared, and then asking him plainly where I appeared in any of it. He had no answer. My name was everywhere as a number, and nowhere as a person. He finally admitted, quietly, that he had spent years watching my father succeed, without ever holding it over him, and that somewhere along the way, he had simply wanted to feel that same success for himself. Using money that was never his to claim, Sophie, our daughter, saw the document later that same afternoon and asked her father directly how long before her grandfather died he had written it. When he answered 11 months, the disappointment on her face said more than any argument I could have started. That night, after everyone left, I told Derek plainly that I needed him to move out. He asked if I was divorcing him, and I told him honestly that I had not decided yet, but that this was the first major decision in our house that nobody else would be allowed to make for me. Derek moved into a one-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away, taking 3 quiet trips in his SUV with no dramatic scenes, no arguments on the lawn, nothing for the neighbors to whisper about. The months that followed were nowhere near as satisfying as people imagine walking away from a betrayal should feel. I missed him in strange, small ways. The sound of his key in the door, even his ridiculous habit of leaving cabinet doors open, missing someone. I learned slowly, does not mean you are wrong to have let them go. Derek eventually found another sales position, one that paid less and demanded more driving than his old job ever had. When he told me, I said I was glad, and he managed a tired, honest smile, admitting it was nobody's fault but his own. Carol renewed her lease after negotiating a smaller increase. Renee took a full-time position and began working through her debt with an actual repayment plan. Nobody ended up destitute. Nobody lost their home. The disaster everyone seemed so certain I was about to cause simply never happened, because it was never mine to cause in the first place. Derek and I eventually began therapy, separately at first, then together. During one session, our counselor asked him why he had been so certain I would eventually agree to everything he had planned. He sat quietly for a long time before admitting that I always came around, that I usually gave in. Sitting across from him, I finally understood that I had spent years calling that pattern compromise, when in truth, it had simply been me disappearing a little more each time to keep the peace. Eventually, Derek apologized without trying to explain it away, without turning it into an excuse, and I believed him. But believing someone is trying to change does not obligate you to return to the version of yourself who had to be hurt before they finally did. We filed for legal separation and later moved forward with divorce, quietly and without cruelty. Around that time, Sophie and I finally cleared out my father's house, something I had avoided for far too long. We found nothing dramatic hidden in a drawer, no secret letter we had somehow missed, just my father, exactly as he was, hardware store receipts, 3 pairs of reading glasses, 4 separate tape measures, because apparently one of them had once, according to him, lied. We laughed for the first time inside that house since he had passed. Sophie asked if her grandfather had known Derek would do all of this, and I told her honestly that I did not think so. I believed he had simply noticed something that quietly worried him, and had chosen to give me time instead of a warning. Time I did not even know I needed, until it was already protecting me. I did not do anything dramatic with the inheritance once it finally settled. I strengthened my retirement accounts, secured my housing after the divorce, created an education fund for any future grandchildren, and donated to the same community college scholarship program my father had quietly supported for years. When I eventually helped Sophie with a down payment, we sat together first and talked honestly about what that money meant and what it did not. A 20-minute conversation that may have been the healthiest financial discussion anyone in my family had all year. The final divorce paperwork took longer than either of us expected, and afterward, strangely enough, Derek and I got coffee together in a quiet parking lot. He asked if I ever wondered what would have happened had he simply stayed at his job. I told him maybe we would still be married, but the real problem would still have been sitting there underneath everything, waiting. He asked what problem I meant, and I told him plainly that he had believed being my husband gave him ownership over things that were never his to claim. The inheritance had simply made that belief expensive enough for me to finally notice it. For a long time, I believed my father's final gift to me was $3.8 million. It was not. The truest gift he left me was time. Enough time to see clearly what I would have talked myself out of seeing if the money had simply landed in our joint account the week he died. 3 days after my father passed away, my husband quit his job because he believed my inheritance meant neither of us would ever have to work again. He was wrong about that. Derek eventually went back to work, and in a much quieter way, so did I. Except the job I finally walked away from was one I had been working for 22 years without ever realizing it. The job of smoothing things over, giving in, and mistaking silence for peace. If you have ever had to learn the difference between keeping the peace